Now, pesticides, we can go into so many different specific chemical contaminants. We can even go into the nucleotides like radon. There's just so much to talk about with water. But I wanted to just kind of hit up some of the big ones. Pesticides, we are just inundated. After the 1950s, we really just exploded with environmental pesticides, but pesticides for bugs when soldiers were going off to war, and we wanted to protect them from malaria and other kind of bacteria infestation. But in this country, we just never, ever bridled the whole idea of creating pesticides without understanding their risks to human health. I know you'll be hearing from other people in this panel, or already have, but we'll talk about a few of these chemicals. We just have an enormous amount. We have over, I think, 1,100 pesticides listed in farming, and they're not required for any major testing or any testing on health, safety, toxicity, particularly in certain populations where they could be more affected, such as pregnant women, such as children, such as the immune compromised populations. They're everywhere. They're regulated by the EPA under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture estimated that 50 million people in the United States obtain their drinking water from groundwater that's potentially contaminated by pesticides and other agricultural chemicals. And we know that USGS, United States Geological Survey, shows a lot of contamination of pesticides, because where do they run off? Into our waterways. Chesapeake Waterway is just one prime example. If you want to read about a case of a real sad situation of that runoff and what it's done to the water and the biodiversity and life within the Chesapeake Bay. So Atrazine is probably one of the most used pesticides in the central part of the United States. It is really quite toxic. Colleagues like Hayes, Dr. Hayes, I'm trying to remember his first name, Tyrone Hayes, who's out of UC Berkeley, did some beautiful TED Talks on this. He's a major researcher on atrazine and could see that actually tadpoles were changing from male into female, that they would have dual male and female reproductive structures in waterways that were exposed to very low levels of atrazine, the type of levels that humans would be exposed to. So his work was pretty groundbreaking. So it's definitely worth, understanding how atrazine affects our environments, but it also gets into our bodies as well. And atrazine is certainly an endocrine disruptor, but also carcinogenic as well. But this is one of the pesticides that's still widely used in the US. Glyphosate. We're going to hear a lot about glyphosate, I have a feeling, over the next few days. But I have a personal story, because glyphosate is sprayed and has been sprayed for the last 20 years out my backyard. And long before I even knew there was any issues with glyphosate, or even farming for that matter. And irony is, it's right outside my back door. Glyphosate is one of the nation's largest used by volume pesticides. It's an herbicide. It's Roundup. If you buy it in one of the big box stores, it's called Roundup, but it's an herbicide. It goes after plants and weeds. And you can see just the explosion of glyphosate, some from 1992 here to 2013. This is in our book, and we do a huge section on glyphosate. Because it's definitely worth noting about all the issues. We know that there were some major legal announcements in terms of the payouts, 58 million, I think, for one of the lawn service workers at a school for having developed, I want to see either multiple myeloma or lymphoma or leukemia. Actually, I'm not really sure on that detail, but of course it was sort of the turning point where a lot of cases were starting to tee up in terms of the effects of glyphosate with exposure causing cancers. I think we're going to start to see more glyphosate being moved out. I post on my Smart Human Facebook feed, Twitter, Instagram. It's called The Smart Human. I post quite a bit of stuff that comes up in the news, whether it's a new blocking of glyphosate in parks and recreations in Miami, or whether Mexico just banned glyphosate, which it did. So there's a lot of real-time messaging I like to give when I see positive changes in the market. But glyphosate is a real concern. And, we've been using more and more of it because the herbs, it's a herbicide. So the weeds are becoming resistant. And so there's been needing to be more spraying to get rid of the same weeds that may have been only needing one spray a few years ago. Maybe now they need more, 2 sprays per season. So, we're getting more glyphosate that's infiltrating our food system. It's getting into honey, it's getting into beer, we talk about all of that in the book, but it's really interesting to see how it kind of, it all flows downhill from the actual source of the food to the actual manufactured product. This is my backyard or side yard, and you can see that field over there is actually not owned by us, but for many, many years was sprayed once or twice a year with glyphosate. And I would remember it come up and it would burn, it would joggle, all the chemical would actually fall out of the side a little and it would burn. It would have like a burn mark all the way up the side. I didn't know what it was. I didn't think about it. So now I know, and now I'm trying to fight it. And so far, so good. I'm working with local farmers on these issues, which I hope people will think about for their own backyards. So this is a slide just showing how water flows into lower parts of the background of our water, into our aquifers. There are issues there as well in terms of aquifers, in terms of the lower you go into groundwater, you're also going to get different metals and different minerals, good, bad, or ugly. And so there's risks to water that's above the surface, and of course, water that's below the surface. They both have their risks. But you can see how things basically get absorbed lower and lower, and aquifers do serve as water for our water treatment plants as well. Fracking has been a really important issue. I don't want to go into too much detail here. I want to watch the clock. Wow. But we are really starting to see a lot of downstream effects of hydraulic fracking in terms of waterways that are being affected, leaving these chemicals under the earth with mixtures that are not available to the consumer, and making their way into aquifers, into bodies, into wells. We have to be very thoughtful about this process. Microplastics, another fun one. Well, we now know that plastics are breaking down, and then they'll eventually get to such small sizes that they'll be able to infiltrate water. When we're seeing that in certain tap water and certain bottled water that was tap water, that came from taps, we're seeing this globally, that microplastics are making their way into the fish we eat, into their meat, into the fish meat, but also into our glasses. Here we have from the Guardian, plastic fibers found in tap water around the world, study reveals. So we're starting to see now what they do clinically to the human body is still unclear. I will say that we don't have any, I have not seen any studies personally, maybe someone who's listening has seen them, but I have not seen any specific study showing some type of an association with specific illness. I think it's because we're just being inundated by too many chemicals in different ways. But I think plastics are not anthropologically appropriate to be in our body. So I'll leave it at that. All right. So nearly 77 million people. This is a report by NRDC. Let me just get to my notes here. This is by the NRDC, which is the Natural Resources Defense Council, found that 90% of violations of the water systems of the Safe Drinking Water Act were not even reprimanded. Basically, no actions were taken. And you can see that there are just violations all the time. In 2015, 80,000 violations that impacted drinking water systems in every state, which is around 27 million, basically 1 in 12. So there's violations happening all the time, but they're not being reprimanded, and they're not necessarily having to pay any fines. And there's usually no repercussions and no formal action taken. So in this particular report, you can see the list of bad actors in terms of their report, in terms of their penalties. Yay, New Jersey. I love my state, but I also throw it under the bus because we are a prime example of some pretty, bad legislation that needs to be fixed nationally, not just in New Jersey. But we were ranked 4th amongst drinking water violations. This is 2017. I wonder if this will make its way to Murphy. All right, so here's the report card on infrastructure. So let's talk about engineers. Let's talk about the people who actually have to deal with our water systems in terms of how they're designed and built and what they can do. We now know that New York, because I gave this talk in New York a few years back, New York has a drinking water grade of C or C minus, but C for drinking water. Okay, so that doesn't bode well. And these are let me see if I have the name of them. Yes, this is from the American Society of Civil Engineers, a team of engineers that, across New York State. And so this is a respected group. It's the ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers. What do the grades mean? Basically, a C represents mediocre, requires attention. General signs of deterioration requires attention. Significant deficiencies in conditions, increasing vulnerability to risk. So I wouldn't want to go for a C. Now here's New Jersey's report card. Their drinking water was, let me see, where does it say? Bridges, ports, parks, levees, solid hazardous waste. Drinking water was a C also. So we tied with New York. Same, it's from the American Society of Civil Engineers.